I crashed straight into the car of the Mafia boss, Dante Valente. A deafening explosion tore through the night. His $1 million Pagani burst into flames at turn 17. The crowd screamed, "She just killed the boss!" Before the smoke cleared, he stepped out of the fire. Shirt torn, blood dripping from his lip, eyes cold as a blade. "You just crashed into the wrong man." I thought he would kill me right there. Instead, he bent down, gripped my chin, and said in a low, commanding voice, "From now on, you belong to me. You race, I make the rules." The next day, the news called me Crash Girl. And in the underworld, I had only one name left: Dante Valente's woman, the girl who, with a single crash, became his possession. I know, that's a heavy place to start. And if you've ever had one of those days where the whole world just decides to turn against you, you know exactly the kind of cold dread I felt standing there. The heat of the fire on my back, watching Dante Valente look at me like I was something he found stuck to the bottom of his shoe. It felt like I'd just stepped into a life I hadn't earned and definitely hadn't asked for. And I have to pause for just a quick second, because telling this story is important to me, and if you're listening right now, if you're feeling what I'm saying, I'd love it if you'd just take a second to open up your phone, hit that like button so more people can find this, leave a quick comment below if anything I've said so far resonates, and please, just tap subscribe. It helps me know that I'm not just talking to myself in an empty room. Knowing you're out there watching, supporting me, it gives me the strength to keep walking through these heavy memories, because the story, well, it only gets harder from here. I remember the smell of gasoline and rain, and the way the flashing red and blue lights turned the smoke an ugly, artificial pink. The sound of the crowd's initial shriek had faded, replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the hiss of steam rising from the wet asphalt. Dante stood there, imposing and entirely undisturbed by the $1 million of wreckage behind him, his presence radiating a kind of magnetic danger that felt far more terrifying than the fire itself. The man who had been riding with me, Marco, he had vanished the second the car spun out, and I realized then, maybe for the first time, that I had been truly, completely alone on that track, abandoned by the one person I thought was my friend. The police, the real ones, they never showed up to the Valente Grand Prix. This whole thing was settled long before any official papers could be drawn up, settled by men in dark suits who carried the kind of authority that didn't come from a badge. And the moment Dante released my face, turning to give a silent instruction to one of those sharp-eyed guys, I knew my life was over. I was Lena Moretti, the girl who could fix anything with an engine, the one who worked 3 jobs just to keep my busted-up garage door from falling off the track. And now I was the one who had accidentally torched the crown jewel of the Valente empire. I had been foolish, maybe, for fixing Marco's car in the first place, for agreeing to the secret tuning session that night, for believing a single high-speed favor could erase a debt. Marco swearing he had a sudden fever, insisting I take the wheel for just 1 lap, saying it was a massive debt to a dangerous man, a debt I now inherited with a fiery crash. I didn't see the setup then, not really, but the moment Dante's shadow fell over me, I felt the trap snap shut, feeling the chill of the midnight air even though the wreck was still burning like a bonfire right behind us. The next day, it was all gone. My little garage, the one I'd inherited from my grandfather, the one that smelled permanently of oil and determination, a scent of honest work and clean metal, was reduced to a pile of twisted metal and cinder blocks. It wasn't burned down. It was systematically dismantled, like a surgical procedure performed by a monster who didn't want fire. Just total, untraceable obliteration. I remember the precision of the destruction, how the heavy lift chains were cut right at the base, how the air compressor was simply crushed, not detonated, just to ensure nothing salvageable remained. A clinical demonstration of power that was somehow more terrifying than any bomb. The sign that had said Lena's auto was snapped clean in half, and I stood there in the daylight, holding my wrench kit, the only thing I'd managed to grab, and watched a man in a crisp white shirt nail a formal, legally drawn-up notice to the remaining wall. The paper was heavy, official, bearing seals and legal jargon that mocked my simple life. It wasn't just a notice of eviction. It was a revocation of every license I'd ever held, every certification, every shred of legal credibility I had in this world, erasing decades of my family's honest labor with a single stroke of a pen. My name, Lena Moretti, was officially blacklisted from every shop, every parts supplier, every organized competition, and every chance at a normal life. The man didn't even look at me. He just adjusted his cuff, a movement that spoke volumes about how little my existence mattered, a dismissive gesture that confirmed I was entirely insignificant in his well-ordered world, and then drove off in a car so silent and expensive it felt like an insult to my destroyed workspace. I sat on a broken bucket, running my fingers over the cold, greasy metal of my wrench, the last tangible link to the person I used to be. That night, sitting there in the rubble, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, feeling the cold indifference of the city around me, that's when Dante Valente's men finally found me and brought me, not to a jail cell, where I might have found some legal grounding, but straight into the velvet cage he called his empire, a place where the rules of the normal world simply didn't apply. They didn't waste any time. One minute I was scraping dust off my face, the next I was tied to a chair in what I recognized immediately as Dante Valente's private, hermetically sealed, impossibly spotless garage. It wasn't just a garage. It was a tomb, a cathedral of carbon fiber and polished steel, lit by cold, bright lights that made everything feel exposed and clinical, where the air was scented with expensive leather and the faint, sweet smell of high-octane racing fuel. He walked a slow circle around me, a predator examining its quarry, not touching me, just letting the sheer size of the room and the weight of his silence crush me down. He was wearing fresh clothes now, a dark suit that somehow managed to look both casual and utterly lethal, and the cut on his lip was barely visible, just a faint red line that drew my eye every time he turned. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a murmur, yet it vibrated in the metal walls. "Your life now belongs to me. You race. I make the rules," he repeated, turning the words over like pieces of dull, heavy metal, establishing his ownership with chilling finality. The injustice of it all, the erasure of my life for a mistake that wasn't even entirely mine, boiled up inside me. I didn't know where I found the courage. Maybe it was the smell of the pristine oil that made me miss my own dirtier, messier life. Maybe it was the simple refusal to be utterly destroyed. But I locked eyes with him, lifted my chin, and spat out the only thing I could think of that felt like defiance, the refusal to acknowledge his claim. "I don't owe you anything." The flicker of something, not anger, but a cold, assessing curiosity, crossed his face before he pressed a button on a remote. A massive holographic screen flickered to life on the wall, and suddenly, the night of the crash was playing in a vivid loop. But this wasn't the amateur footage I had seen. This was high-definition, multi-angle telemetry, showing every variable. My speed, my angle of attack, the precise moment of failure. It showed Marco's car, my car, technically, since I was driving it, coming into that 17th curve, a curve I had taken 1,000 times, and then the disastrous turn, the loss of control, the hard, unforgiving impact with his silver Pagani. He let the explosion fade into static before turning the screen off. The silence that followed was louder than any engine, heavier than any threat. He leaned down, placing his hand flat on the top of the chair, trapping me under his gaze, and the smell of expensive cologne and something subtly metallic, maybe gunpowder, maybe just fear, filled the air. He didn't focus on my driving error. He focused on the improbability of the crash. "You think I'm stupid enough to believe what's on camera?" he murmured, his voice cutting through my fear with unexpected precision, suggesting that the visible result was merely the end of a much more complex, unseen equation. I stared back, confusion replacing my fear. What did he mean? The evidence was right there, visible to the whole world. But he just smiled, a small, tight, dangerous movement of his mouth, a gesture of a man who saw layers where others only saw surface. And then he was forcing me to join his private racing team. Not as a choice, but as the only way to repay a debt that wasn't just about the car, but about my very existence. My life now functioning as a piece of collateral in his brutal, beautiful game, a tool in an investigation I didn't even know I was part of. The training began immediately, a relentless grind that stripped away the simple joy I once found in mechanics. I was thrown into the pit crew's harsh world, surrounded by men who looked at me with varying degrees of suspicion, lust, and outright hatred. These were men who lived by a code of loyalty and brute force, and my presence, the cause of their boss's humiliation, was an insult to their very existence. My humble background, my dirt under the fingernails honesty, it stood out like a cheap patch on a silk suit in that sterile, high-stakes environment. Dante never supervised me directly, but he was always there, a magnetic center of gravity around which the entire organization moved, his influence a palpable pressure in the air. He had a way of watching me from the distance, a quiet, analytical gaze that felt less like he was looking at a person and more like he was studying a complex, possibly broken machine he intended to fix or exploit. He wasn't watching my speed. He was watching my reactions. I was pushed harder than I'd ever been, physically exhausted from the track work, the long hours in the simulator where the centrifugal forces were cranked up to punishing levels, and the constant awareness that one wrong move, one moment of weakness, could end me. I was racing cars that were 10 times more powerful than anything I'd ever touched. Vehicles with engines roaring so loud they became a physical pressure inside my chest. A constant dizzying test of courage and skill I wasn't sure I could pass, constantly feeling the weight of the Valente Empire resting on the accuracy of my steering. One afternoon, I was running a practice lap on a wet track, trying to push a custom-built V12 past its limits, the car hydroplaning slightly as I hit a patch of standing water. I fought the wheel back, barely holding the line, when the engine backfired, a sudden explosive flare of fire shooting out of the exhaust pipe, momentarily blinding the mirrors with a blast of heat. It was a momentary thing, just a maintenance glitch. But the sound, the flash of orange light, it hit me like a physical blow, snapping me back to the raw, visceral terror of the crash. It was the same noise, the same intense heat I'd felt when Marco's car crashed, a phantom replay of my own failure and fear, a moment of trauma that bypassed my intellect and struck right at my survival instinct. A high, raw, involuntary sound tore from my throat, a cry of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed through the otherwise empty track. A sound I barely recognized as my own. The engine sound faded, but my scream hung in the air, a sign of weakness I couldn't retract. I quickly cut the engine and tried to compose myself, the smell of burnt oil overwhelming me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely release the steering wheel. But it was too late. Dante, who had been watching the feed from the observation deck, appeared moments later, his face unreadable, yet his eyes held a depth of disturbance I hadn't seen before. A strange, haunted look that seemed to connect my terror to a memory of his own. He didn't ask what was wrong, didn't demand an explanation, but I felt his gaze linger on my face, a heavy, searching weight that seemed to peer right through my bravado, looking for something in my reaction that the data couldn't provide. Later that evening, the pieces of his suspicions started to fit together, creating a chilling tapestry of calculated manipulation. I was sitting alone, trying to reread the engine telemetry, the only way I could process the near miss, when a security guard carelessly left Dante's private log visible on a nearby monitor, clearly marked AV case file. My name was at the top, but underneath it, in a separate file, was the date of his brother's death, years ago, and a brief, clinical note. Witness account. Subject screamed at the moment of impact. Not a typical reaction to failure. Consistent with trauma response. It was a chilling realization. The crash I caused was not the end of the story, but the beginning of his own investigation. He hadn't kept me alive out of mercy or passion. He had kept me because that single, terrified sound I made, the scream of someone who had seen too much fire, matched the scream he must have heard in his memories, the sound his brother must have made just before he died. He wasn't seeing me as the culprit anymore. He was starting to see me as a key, a broken lock he needed to pick to unlock the mystery that destroyed his past. A man so consumed by a ghost that he was willing to use me as a living, breathing bait to uncover a truth that ran deeper than the surface of a simple, illegal street race. And I realized I was merely a pawn in his quest for a painful, decade-old reckoning. The day of my first official race was a calculated disaster, a public crucifixion orchestrated for the eyes of the entire underworld. I was forced to compete against Rico Vega, a man who, I learned, had once been Dante's closest friend, his right hand on and off the track, but now served as his unpredictable rival in the shadow economy, a man seething with resentment at being sidelined. Rico, a lean man with a snake-like charm and an entitlement that hung on him like cheap cologne, made it instantly clear that he considered me less than nothing, a gutter rat, a liability, a cheap trophy Dante was keeping just to show he could. His eyes, though, held a strange, unsettling blend of pity and rage, as if he pitied me for what was coming, but raged against Dante for putting me there, forcing him to compete with someone he viewed as utterly beneath him. Before the race, he sauntered over to my car, his movements smooth and predatory, running a gloved finger along the pristine paintwork. "Look at you, crash girl," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the entire pit crew to hear, his words dripping with contempt. "Valente keeps the trash close, hoping it'll turn to gold. Too bad you're already scrap metal, destined for the dumpster." I didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact, just kept my focus on adjusting my harness, my silence a wall he couldn't climb over. But his words landed heavily, pressing down on the shame I was already carrying, making me feel every bit the low-status girl they all assumed I was. The race itself was brutal. Rico drove with a reckless aggression that was barely contained, pushing me into corners, almost clipping my rear bumper on straightaways, clearly trying to intimidate me into making a mistake. But I held the line, my focus absolute. Then, just as we hit the final sector, I felt a terrifying looseness in the brake pedal. It was subtle at first, just a slight delay, but within seconds the pedal went soft and dead, sinking uselessly to the floor. The initial fear was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating fury as I realized this wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. Rico, who was 100 yards ahead, suddenly executed a perfect, unnecessary drift, his tires kicking up a shower of sparks and smoke. It was a victory gesture, a cold, calculated signal that he knew exactly what he had just done, a final, spiteful flourish. I fought the steering wheel, desperately trying to scrub speed by downshifting and rubbing against the concrete barrier, the friction screaming in protest. But the car, a beautiful, wild beast of engineering, was now nothing more than an out-of-control missile heading straight for the concrete barrier. The engine block groaned under the strain of the sudden downshifts, and then, with a deafening thwump, the car burst into flames before I could even make it to the escape hatch, the flames licking at the glass, trapping me in the inferno. I somehow clawed my way out, my racing suit smoking, my lungs burning, rolling across the track just as the entire vehicle was swallowed by a hungry wall of orange fire. The heat so intense it felt like my skin was peeling away. I tasted blood and grit and the bitter tang of failure. The roaring of the crowd was no longer one of excitement, but one of morbid satisfaction, their cheers directed not at the winner, but at the spectacle of my destruction. The headlines the next morning screamed, "Valente keeps a woman just to humiliate her on the track," portraying me as nothing more than a burnt sacrifice to Dante's ego. I was a spectacle, a failure, a burnt offering to the god of the underground races. Later, as I was sitting in the medical bay, the smell of burnt rubber and adrenaline clinging to my skin, I overheard two of the crew members whispering in the hallway. "The boss only keeps her around to break her," one muttered, the sound echoing the painful truth that was already settling in my gut. They talked about me like I was a toy, a broken thing with no consequence. I looked across the room to where Dante stood, perfectly still, watching the race replay on a silent screen. He hadn't moved when the car exploded. He hadn't flinched. He was simply watching the footage, his expression a mask of cold indifference, yet that faint flicker of disturbance was still there, a minuscule crack in his granite exterior. I pulled myself up, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ribs, and walked over to him, stopping just a foot away, forcing him to acknowledge my singed, broken presence, my silent demand for truth. My voice was a rasp, low and entirely devoid of emotion, the only way I could keep the pain from showing, the exhaustion from breaking. "Do you want me to race? Or to die?" I asked, holding his gaze, the question a quiet challenge to the calculating cruelty I saw reflected in his eyes, daring him to admit his true intention. He didn't answer with words. He merely stared at the point where the car had been, and then at the scars of smoke still rising from the track, the silence stretching out between us, thick and oppressive. He didn't have to. His silence was the loudest, cruelest answer he could have given, confirming every whispered accusation in the hallway. He saw me as a tool, a necessary piece of bait, a living reminder of the brother he lost, and my survival was only useful if it served his deeper, darker purpose. The humiliation was complete, not because I failed to finish, but because I had been exposed as a plaything, a pawn easily discarded and nearly burned alive in front of the very people who defined my new life as Dante Valente's property. The incident, however, served as a grim catalyst. I had been reckless before, driven by desperation, but now I was driven by a cold, quiet need for justice, a need to prove that I was more than just a convenient scapegoat for his family's dark history. I spent the next few days in a self-imposed exile, poring over the car's schematics, the few I could salvage, trying to trace the point of failure. But the evidence was gone, consumed by the flames, leaving only the chilling certainty of Rico's calculated betrayal. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply channeled all the shame, all the pain, all the fear, into a cold, hard knot of resolve, a quiet determination to escape this velvet cage and reclaim my life, or at least the truth of it. The weather seemed to mirror my despair. Rain started falling, a cold, relentless sheet that turned the tarmac into a slick, dangerous mirror. It was the kind of night that blurred the edges of the world, making escape seem less like a plan and more like a desperate, impossible prayer. I knew I couldn't stay, couldn't endure another race, another piece of public degradation, couldn't live another day as Dante's humiliated toy. I slipped out of the heavily guarded compound, taking only my grandfather's wrench kit, the small, familiar weight of it comforting in my trembling hand, and the clothes on my back, moving like a ghost through the downpour, the cold rain washing away the grime and the shame, replacing it with a fresh, sharp determination. I made it as far as the abandoned service tunnels that ran beneath the old circuit, a maze of cracked concrete and dripping pipes I knew from my days as a simple mechanic, shortcuts and hiding places only the locals knew, when I heard the distinct, low purr of an engine behind me. The sound wasn't loud. It was deep, customized, and utterly unmistakable, a sound that spoke of wealth and lethal intent. It was Dante. I pressed myself against the damp, mildewed wall of the tunnel, listening to the heavy, deliberate rhythm of his tires crunching over the loose gravel. He wasn't speeding. He was hunting, enjoying the process, making sure I knew he was right behind me, like a cat toying with a trapped mouse, confident that my escape was just a momentary distraction. He finally stopped his vehicle right in the middle of the narrow lane, his headlights blinding me, turning me into a panicked deer in his powerful, unforgiving beam. I stood frozen in the light, the water streaming down my face, tasting salty like tears but feeling cold like ice. He didn't get out. He just rolled the window down, and the smell of the damp air mixed with the leather of his expensive car. "Run, if you think you're fast enough to escape me," he challenged, his voice amplified by the enclosed space, echoing with a dry, almost bored amusement, as if this whole desperate chase was just a minor inconvenience to him. It wasn't a demand. It was a gauntlet thrown down, an invitation to a final deadly game of his design. And I knew if I stayed, I would lose. But if I ran, I might just win a few more minutes of breath, a few more yards of freedom. So I took the challenge. So I ran. I scrambled back into the car I had hidden just moments before. A salvaged, stripped-down racing shell I had worked on in secret, replacing cheap parts with custom-made ones. A vehicle built purely for speed and agility, stripped of any luxury. I didn't turn on the lights. The tunnel was a black hole, the only illumination coming from the twin beams of Dante's car pursuing me relentlessly. It was a race in the dark, a primal battle of instinct and memory. No rules, no grandstands, only the sound of roaring engines and the frantic pounding of my own heart against the rhythm of the cylinders. I relied on the ghost-like familiarity of the track, the memory of every crack in the pavement, every dip and rise, pushing the car to the absolute edge of its ability, trusting my hands and my memory more than my sight. The darkness was suffocating, the adrenaline a heavy, dizzying rush, but the sheer effort of controlling the car in that environment forced me out of my despair and back into the purest form of my skill, the absolute, cold focus of a true mechanic driver. We sped through the black tunnel, the tires screeching and spitting water on the tight, hairpin turns, the echo of the engines deafening. I was holding my own, matching his speed, navigating purely by feel, and the faint, diffused light bouncing off the water-slicked walls, my muscle memory taking over where my eyes failed. Then, we hit curve 17. The infamous curve. The place where my old life ended and this new hell began. As I entered the corner, my hands automatically executed a counterintuitive maneuver, a slight, almost imperceptible turn of the wheel that shifted the car's weight distribution perfectly, gripping the slick pavement at an angle that defied physics, a technique that was not taught in any formal racing school, but in the deepest, most dangerous underground. It was a move I hadn't consciously thought about in years, a technique taught to me long ago, a signature of absolute control in the face of imminent loss. Suddenly, the roar of Dante's engine behind me faltered, then stopped completely, the silence hitting me like a physical wall. I skidded to a halt a few yards further, my own engine still idling, breathing heavily in the silence. I waited for the shot, the reprimand, the brutal end. Instead, I just heard the soft sound of his car door opening. Dante walked slowly toward me, stepping out of the darkness and into the faint spill of light from the tunnel exit, his figure imposing and rigid. He stopped by my driver's side window, and for the first time since that fiery night, his eyes didn't look cold. They looked hollow, haunted, confused, as if a ghost had just walked over his grave. "Who taught you to drive?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the rain muffling the words until they sounded like a distant plea, a question that held the weight of his entire past. I took a deep, shaky breath, the metallic taste of fear still strong on my tongue, but I straightened my shoulders, locking my gaze on his. I owed him nothing, least of all the truth, but something in his fractured look compelled me to give him this one piece of the puzzle. "They called him Ghost Racer," I answered, the name feeling strange on my lips after so long, like I was summoning a memory. "He said winning isn't about surviving, it's about never bowing." Dante didn't move. His breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound of absolute shock, the kind of sound a man makes when reality shifts under his feet. The rain continued to pour, washing over his face, mixing with the blood from his cut lip that never quite seemed to heal. The name, Ghost Racer, hung in the air, a phantom limb suddenly appearing in the tunnel. And in that moment, I understood the depth of the rabbit hole I had fallen into. Ghost Racer, Dante's brother, the man whose crash had haunted him for years, the man whose memory was the foundation of the empire he now ruled. That man had been my mentor, my teacher, the one who had seen a potential in a scrappy young mechanic that no one else had. The realization hit us both like a physical blow. The brother Dante had mourned, the brother whose death he was trying to solve, was the same man who had taught me the technique I had just used. The technique that was his brother's unmistakable signature on the track. The move he had only ever seen once before, years ago, at the moment of the fatal accident. I wasn't just a scapegoat or a piece of bait. I was the last living link to his past, a direct connection to the shadow that had destroyed his life. And the terrible setup that had brought me into his world suddenly looked far more sinister than a simple accident, revealing a conspiracy that targeted both the living and the dead. The fragile, unsettling truce that followed was built on the shaky ground of shared suspicion, on the undeniable fact that our lives were now tragically intertwined by a ghost. But that truce was quickly obliterated by Rico Vega, who was not just a rival, but a panicked, desperate man. He was scrambling, clearly sensing that the control he once held over Dante, and the illusion of my guilt, was slipping with every hour Dante spent staring at the telemetry of my driving style. One morning, Dante strode into the lounge where I was trying to read, his face a thundercloud, his movements sharp and aggressive, the very air around him vibrating with controlled rage. He didn't say hello, didn't give me a chance to speak. He slammed a secure phone down on the polished mahogany table, and a cold, synthetic voice filled the room, repeating a terrifying, impossible confession. I cut the brakes. The voice, my voice, but twisted, modulated, and utterly emotionless, stripped of all human inflection, said clearly, "He drove like a fool, and I fixed his problem." The audio repeated twice, 3 times, each iteration driving a cold, sharp blade into the tentative trust that had started to form between us. The final, undeniable proof designed to crush any shred of doubt. Dante's voice was like grinding steel, every syllable laced with cold fury. "Anything to say?" he demanded, staring at me as if I were a piece of filth he'd just scraped off his shoe, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. My blood ran cold. It was my voice, a short sound clip I vaguely remembered recording weeks ago, answering some mundane question about track maintenance, but it had been expertly manipulated, woven into a horrifying confession that seemed to perfectly explain every doubt he had ever held. I felt my entire body freeze, the shock of the deepfake, of this impossible, insidious betrayal, paralyzing my ability to speak, to defend myself against such a perfect, digital lie. I saw the doubt, the devastating flicker of renewed betrayal in Dante's eyes. The moment he realized the person he was beginning to believe in might have been lying all along. A masterful deception that went beyond simple human error. He had trusted the feeling, the technique, the truth in my scream, but the cold digital evidence was undeniable. It was my voice admitting to the crime, turning my truth into his personal hell. His face hardened, the look of pain dissolving into pure, ancient rage, his grief weaponized by the enemy. "You were my brother's student, and you killed him?" The accusation was a hammer blow, crushing the possibility of an alliance, of respect, of anything other than mutual, destructive hatred, forcing him back into the role of the vengeful boss. I looked at the floor, unable to meet the fury in his eyes. What could I say? The truth, that my voice had been stolen, weaponized, twisted into a perfect lie by a technical genius, sounded pathetic and hollow next to the sterile evidence, the kind of desperate lie a true culprit would invent. I swallowed the lump in my throat, straightened my spine, and raised my eyes to meet his. I knew his pain was real. knew his need for vengeance was the only thing keeping him standing in that opulent, lonely room, keeping his empire from crumbling around him. I felt a surge of cold, protective pity for the powerful man who was so utterly broken by loss, forced to choose between the evidence of his ears and the instinct of his gut. My voice was quiet, definitive, accepting the role he needed me to play, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me plead, "If you need someone to hate to survive, use me. But don't call it justice." I turned and walked away, not running, not pleading, but walking away with the quiet dignity that comes from having nothing left to lose, leaving Dante standing alone in the silent room, trapped with his brother's ghosts, and the shattering truth of a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound, forced to confront the impossible choice between revenge and redemption. The weight of the lie, the sheer impossibility of fighting a digital phantom, drove me to the edge. Rico was clearly working for someone bigger, someone with the technical capability to create such a perfect forgery, and I knew the only way to clear my name was to confront the source, to fight fire with fire, and technology with sheer mechanical cunning. I didn't care about Dante's empire anymore. I only cared about the truth of my own innocence, the only thing they hadn't managed to burn away. I used the tiny, obsolete laptop I'd kept hidden, an ancient machine that ran on protocols the modern network ignored, relying on the old-school security backdoors that Dante's high-tech systems often overlooked due to their sheer complexity. I spent 3 days hunched over the keyboard, slipping past firewalls, dodging digital traps and honeypots, tracing the digital signature of the warped audio clip until it led me, inevitably, to the secured servers of Orlov, a shadowy rival family known for its expertise in technological warfare and digital assassinations, and the very organization that Rico had been cozying up to recently, trading loyalty for power. I found the unedited file, the original voice clip, tucked away in an encrypted folder, labeled with a mocking date stamp. It was proof, undeniable and clean, that I had been framed, that my voice had been manipulated with chilling skill. I printed the metadata, a simple sheet of paper that suddenly felt heavier than a gold bar, the only key to my freedom, and that's when the lights came up. Orlov's men, professional, emotionless, and wearing the cold expression of men who were used to finishing the job, cornered me in the abandoned server room, a metallic, echoing space that felt like a coffin. They didn't hit hard at first, just painful, calculated blows, breaking me down piece by piece, focusing on points of weakness with unnerving efficiency. They wanted the metadata, the proof, but mostly they wanted to know who else I had shared the information with, desperately trying to trace their leak. I refused to speak, biting back every plea, every gasp of pain, holding on to the secret that Dante, despite his fury, was still the only man capable of turning this information into action, the one person I had trusted with the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. The worst moment was when Orlov himself entered, a cold, elegant man whose cruelty was subtle, almost polite, carrying himself with the practiced ease of inherited power. He held up my wrench kit, the one I cherished from my grandfather, the one I had carried with me since the day my garage was destroyed, turning the familiar tools over in his pale, manicured hands. He used the sharp, polished edge of my own favorite tool, a delicate box-end wrench, to slice open my forearm, just enough for the blood to flow freely, staining the metal surface of the old, broken steering wheel they had mounted on the wall for decoration. He pressed the cold steel to my face, smearing the blood, whispering, "Confess, little mechanic, or this tool will be the last thing you ever see. Your little engine is stalling, Lena." And that's when the door burst open. Dante stood there, framed in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the scene. The blood, the wrench kit, my defiant, broken body, the humiliation painted on the walls, and an expression of calculated, cold fury settled on his face, a mask of controlled, terrifying intent. He didn't hesitate. He played the part perfectly, his acting a masterpiece of dark allegiance. "Give her to me," Dante commanded, his voice loud, dripping with feigned malice, the betrayal stinging my ears even though I knew it was a performance. "I'll finish this myself. No need to dirty your hands with my trash. She's my property after all." Orlov hesitated, clearly surprised, but the opportunity to humiliate Dante publicly was too tempting to resist. He handed me over, stepping back with a smug look, and as Dante dragged me toward the door, his grip brutal and non-negotiable, Orlov pulled out a pistol, savoring the final moment of power. "A shame to waste such a beautiful scene," he mocked, lifting the gun and aiming it right at the back of Dante's head, thinking he had won. Just as Orlov's finger tightened on the trigger, the entire building rocked with a massive, terrifying explosion. The lights went out, plaster rained down, and the smell of high explosives and fire filled the air, Dante's own insurance policy going off exactly on cue. Dante didn't turn around. He shoved me forward, spinning and shielding me with his own body as the secondary charges went off. The entire server room dissolving into an inferno, destroying all evidence and all opposition in one, single, brutal act. I heard the whistle of shrapnel and felt the intense heat of the blast against his back. As the roof started to collapse, he grabbed my hand, pulling me through the debris and the smoke, whispering close to my ear, his voice rough with exertion, but steady with conviction. "I never doubted the fire in your eyes." We stumbled out into the pouring rain, leaving the twisted wreckage of the building, Orlov's network, and the evidence of the deep fake all reduced to ashes. The moment felt surreal, the contrast between the cold, clean rain and the blazing inferno behind us highlighting the impossible danger we had just survived. The silence broken only by the distant wail of emergency sirens that would never dare approach this part of the city. Dante's actions were the most definitive, terrifying proof of his faith in me. He had risked everything, his life, his empire's stability, and the perception of his own sanity, to save me, using the exact tactic Orlov least expected. Total, immediate destruction. A bold move that simultaneously proved my innocence and cemented our terrifying bond. He hadn't needed my confirmation or my defense. He had seen the truth in my silence, in the way I held myself under torture, in the defiant flicker in my eyes that refused to break. The love that was building between us wasn't a fairy tale. It was a brutal, earned trust, forged in the heat of an explosion and cemented by the mutual understanding that we were both survivors in a world designed to use and discard us. Two broken pieces of metal that somehow fit perfectly together. The relief was short-lived. The underworld never accepts loose ends, and Dante's brazen destruction of Orlov's facility, coupled with the open display of affection for the crash girl, who allegedly killed his brother, sent shockwaves through the entire Valente crime council. They were traditionalists, ruthless men who valued legacy and control over everything else, and they saw me as a curse, a catalyst for Dante's weakness, a liability that threatened to unravel decades of carefully constructed power. Days later, I was standing in the center of a tense meeting, surrounded by old, gray-haired men whose eyes held the cold, calculating cruelty of generations, their faces carved from stone and resentment. The leader, a man named Benedetto, spoke with a soft, final authority, his voice barely rising above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Valente loves the woman who killed his brother." He paused, letting the damning statement sink into the silence, letting the accusation hang in the air like poison. Then came the ultimatum, the cold, impossible choice that defined the cruel logic of their world. If you want to keep your empire, kill her. Dante, standing next to me, rigid and impassive, didn't flinch, but I saw the muscles tighten in his jaw, the internal battle raging behind his stone facade, the crushing weight of his duty against the force of his conviction. He chose the most agonizing path. Later that night, he didn't take me to a place of safety or defiance. He chained me, not physically to a wall, but with heavy, symbolic metal restraints, inside the isolated, dark maintenance garage where his brother's body had been recovered years before, a place steeped in his most profound grief. The room was cold, smelling of forgotten oil and permanent grief, a deliberate echo of the past. He stood over me, his face devoid of emotion, the conflict having emptied him completely, leaving only a shell of the powerful man I knew. "You're a curse, not a salvation," he stated, the words sounding hollow, like something he was reading from a script he didn't believe, a necessary lie to save his reputation. I knew he was doing this to save his empire, to protect his authority, to protect me from the council's immediate wrath, because if he killed me, they would stop hunting us both. But the betrayal was a physical ache in my chest, a devastating final act of emotional abandonment. I stared up at him, the chains heavy on my wrists, refusing to let the hurt break me, refusing to cry and give him the relief of my weakness. I wouldn't cry for him. I would make him look at the consequence of his impossible choice. My voice was hoarse, but steady, forcing him to confront the finality of his decision. "If you're going to kill me, look me in the eyes when you pull the trigger," I challenged, my eyes demanding the honesty that his actions lacked, demanding he acknowledge the human cost of his empire. He stood there for a long time, the only sound the slow drip of water from a broken pipe, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. He looked at me, really looked, and I saw the immense weight of his world, the burden of the empire, and the ghost of his brother, crushing him, tearing him apart. But he couldn't do it. He turned on his heel, walked out of the garage, and locked the door behind him. He didn't shoot me, which was a mercy, but he left me alone in the dark, chained and abandoned in the place where his brother died. It was the cruelest answer: silence, abandonment, leaving me to face the specter of his love and the reality of his empire's demands alone, a devastating exile into his most painful memory. I didn't stay in the dark. I didn't curl up and wait to be rescued, or killed. I am a mechanic, a survivor, and I see problems as puzzles that can be solved with enough force and ingenuity. I used the small, almost forgotten toolkit hidden in the heel of my boot, a tiny screwdriver, a shard of tempered steel, the last vestiges of my old life, tools my grandfather had given me. It took hours of agonizing, quiet work, my muscles screaming and my hands bleeding, but I broke free, the metallic snap of the final chain link sounding like a shout of triumph in the suffocating silence. The moment I was unchained, I felt a resurgence of pure, undiluted self. I was no one's curse, no one's victim. I was Lena Moretti, and I was done being played, done being a pawn in their deadly game. I didn't walk out of the compound. I drove out. I went straight to Dante's personal garage, bypassed the security system using the old analog codes his brother had taught me years ago, and stole the fastest, meanest car he owned. A black, custom-built V8 that was all engine and attitude, a car built for impossible speeds and brutal action. I drove until the tires smoked, heading not for the highway, but for the midnight circuit. A mythical, lawless race, the ultimate gathering of the underworld's most dangerous players. A race where every survivor carried a deep sin, where the only prize was survival. I didn't enter quietly. I crashed the starting line, spinning the car around in a screeching, theatrical arc of defiance, blocking the path of the already lined-up vehicles, forcing the entire underworld to look at me. I stood on the roof of Dante's stolen machine, my bloodied hands raised to the sky, and shouted my declaration into the roaring, amazed crowd, my voice carrying over the din of the engines. If I lose, kill me, in front of Valente. It was a challenge to the world, a declaration that my life was no longer collateral, but a weapon, a final wager on my own survival and skill. The race began, a chaotic, brutal symphony of speed and violence, engines screaming like banshees in the night. I drove like a desperate woman with nothing to lose, pushing the stolen V8 past its breaking point, my skill honed by years of scraping by and weeks of high-stakes training under Dante's watchful eye. As I fought through the pack, another car, identical to mine, roared up beside me, pulling a dangerous, calculated maneuver. It was Dante. He hadn't given up. He had joined the race, not to stop me, but to protect me, his presence a silent declaration of war on the council that demanded my death. In the final, deadly lap, just as I was pulling ahead, Orlov's remaining men appeared on an embankment, surrounding the track, their rifles aimed directly at my car, a final, desperate attempt to claim their revenge. Orlov had engineered a final, spectacular assassination. The sound of the gunfire was sharp and terrifying in the night air. I swerved, trying to dodge the barrage of bullets, but I knew I couldn't outrun them, their crosshairs locked on my chassis. Then, in a moment of sublime, heart-stopping terror, Dante swerved his own car, placing his black machine directly between me and the enemy fire. The bullets that were meant for me tore into the side of his car, ripping through the metal and glass. He didn't stop. Instead, he slammed his foot down, using the inertia of the impact to redirect his vehicle in a powerful, sickening collision with Orlov's car, the one carrying the gunman. The crunch of metal, the screech of tires, and then the inevitable violent explosion. Fire erupted, swallowing both vehicles in a massive ball of orange light, a grim echo of the crash that had brought us together. Only this time, the victim was a willing sacrifice. As the heat washed over my face, Dante's last words, carried on the air, reached me. This time, I crash for you. The crash, the symbol of destruction and debt, had returned, not as an accident, but as an act of ultimate, final redemption, a brutal declaration of a love that was willing to sacrifice everything, shattering the curse that had hung over his family. Dante didn't die, but he lay in a deep coma for months, his body broken by the impact, his life hanging by a thread only the machine could monitor, his silence a terrifying void. Without his iron will and terrifying presence, the Valente Empire collapsed like a house of cards, the council dissolving into chaos and infighting. The old men, desperate and fragmented, blamed me for everything. For the crash, for the explosion, for the ruin of their entire system, viewing me as the ultimate curse. I was accused of betrayal, of being a liability, and forced to disappear into the vast forgotten underbelly of the city, hiding in the ruins of the old race tunnels that had once served as my brief, temporary haven. I became a ghost in the shadows, a whisper in the grease-stained garages, an underground legend, the ghost. I didn't race for money or survival anymore. I raced for the sheer, brutal pleasure of motion, of proving that I still existed, that the fire in my eyes had not been extinguished, haunting the edges of the underworld, waiting for the moment to return and reclaim what was ours. One rain-swept night, I found an unsigned invitation slipped under the door of my makeshift shelter, the paper heavy and oddly formal against the damp concrete. It was printed on the highest quality vellum, simple and stark. Midnight circuit, one race, one crown. It was a summons to the ultimate final showdown, a clear sign that the remnants of the old guard were making a last, desperate power grab. The entire underground world knew what this meant. The old order was dead, and this race was the court, the final, terrifying contest to decide who would rule forever, who would collect the ashes of the Valente Empire. I stepped out of the shadows, my racing suit clean, my grandfather's wrench kit strapped securely to my waist, no longer running, but walking toward the fate I had earned, ready to face the final, ultimate danger. The ghost was returning, not to live, but to end the curse that had been placed on my life and on Dante's legacy, ready to burn it all down to the foundations. The final race wasn't what anyone expected. The midnight circuit track was packed, the crowd a silent, expectant mass, the air thick with tension and the smell of exhaust. But the finish line wasn't marked by a victory podium. It was marked by a makeshift throne, cold and imposing. As I pulled up to the starting line, my eyes scanned the lineup of desperate rivals, but my gaze locked onto the man standing at the center of the track, the man who was meant to be my rival. It wasn't Dante. It was his brother. Aurelio Valente, the ghost racer, the man whose crash had started this entire bloody cycle, the man who was supposed to be dead, stood there, immaculate, terrifyingly composed, and alive. My heart dropped, every piece of the puzzle clicking into a devastating final picture of betrayal and manipulation. Aurelio smiled, a cold, utterly empty expression that held no warmth or forgiveness. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't die," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the speakers. A voice that was both familiar and utterly alien, devoid of the kindness my mentor once possessed. "I built the world that killed you." He had faked his death years ago, disappearing into the digital shadows to build a network of control that manipulated his younger brother, the Crime Council, and every race, culminating in the deep fake that shattered our trust. He had sacrificed his brother's soul and my life to become the true, unseen power behind the scenes. Then came the final, chilling revelation. He gestured toward two small, blinking devices mounted on the track's wall. "One in your car, one in Dante's hospital room," he explained with clinical precision. "If Lena wins, Dante dies. If Dante wins, she explodes." He had installed a kill switch, a final, horrifying choice. Choose love and watch your beloved die, or choose self-preservation and kill the only man you ever trusted, forcing us into a destructive paradox. The race began, a blur of impossible speed, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. I knew I couldn't win, and I couldn't lose. The only way out was to destroy the game itself, to break the cycle of violence and control he had created. I drove side by side with Aurelio, relying on the one thing he couldn't hide: his pride in his own skill, his predictable reliance on his perfected technique. As we barreled toward Curve 17, the curve that had defined both of our lives, I worked frantically, using the systems I knew by heart, hacking into the circuit's old timing logic, reversing the polarity of the kill switch, rerouting the detonation sequence into Aurelio's own vehicle. I didn't just turn the wheel. I executed his signature move, the technique he had taught me years ago. A perfect, defiant, 17-degree turn, using his own pattern against him, exploiting the very signature he relied on for control. The resulting force, amplified by the reversed circuit logic and the sudden shift in momentum, was overwhelming. Aurelio's car, responding to the forced trajectory, became instantly unstable, spinning out of control and crashing into the final barrier in a self-immolating fireball, consumed by the very scheme he had engineered. The cycle ended exactly where it began, in a flash of fire. But this time, the crash was not an accident. It was the final, righteous blow of justice, delivered by his own student. I stopped the car just past the finish line, my body shaking, the silence of the crowd overwhelming. I hadn't won a crown. I had earned my freedom, the freedom for both of us. The smoke cleared, and through the haze I saw Dante standing there, alive, his face pale but his eyes blazing with a fierce, absolute recognition, the ghost of his brother finally put to rest. He had woken up from the coma and found the strength to walk, drawn by the final, fatal attraction of the race. He walked slowly through the smoke, past the wreckage of his brother's folly, and took my hand, his grip solid and real, a promise of a future built on truth. Not mine, not yours. Same road. The Empire of Ashes was ours now, not for possession, but for rebuilding, a foundation laid on mutual respect and survival. We walked away from the flames, two survivors who had been broken, underestimated, and used as pawns in a dead man's game, finally free. The world that had judged me by the dirt on my hands and the lack of a famous last name could no longer deny my strength. or the raw, undeniable force of the love forged in the fire. You carried your dignity through hardship, too. You stayed quiet when the world shouted you down. You were always stronger than the label they gave you. You were never small. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and, finally, healing.